John, we'll start with you.
John Weddleton.
Tim Steele.
Amy DeBosky.
Dick Craney.
Suzanne McMahon.
Pete Peterson.
Christopher Constant.
Eric, go ahead.
Eric Croft. Forrest Dunbar.
Okay. Thank you. This meeting is on 2017-140, which I believe is acquisition on the archive site. If you don't know where it's at, I'm sure they'll tell us.
We'll show you a picture.
We have a map.
And there's no homeless there, right?
Actually,
Because I want to spray the people.
I just heard all about it last week.
There's a bunch of ducks there.
Go ahead.
Okay, as you know from the introduction memo, there was a congressional act that was signed by President Obama allowing the municipality to be the purchaser of this property.
Thanks, Obama.
Currently, this is a 9-acre site. It's currently zoned R3. R3 limits the development to only multifamily residential. So, and no commercial retail or office use is allowed. So that was the reason it was in the that we're proposing that we do pre-development activities. The first one would be to rezone it. We are required to pay fair market value. It has been appraised at $4,836,500 plus any of the conveyance costs, appraisals, closing costs will be the purchase price. The financing proposal is to utilize a 5-year municipal interfund loan of $6 million that will cover the purchase price and the conveyance and closing costs. Interest has to be paid on interfund loans on a monthly basis. So we would set aside $750,000 as an interest reserve where the interest would be paid out of that. We don't use it all, it's not a problem, but at least we'll have it if we need to. That would be based on a full 5 years. Then the remainder of that fund would be set up for our pre-development activities, which is a rezone, a tract plat, but it's tracked into some smaller, more manageable size property parcels. And then marketing, sales, and closing costs as we market it to the private development industry for redevelopment in next year. So our proposed timeline would be to purchase the property and get it closed before the end of this year. And then start our submissions for a rezone to an R4A. An R4A district allows for high-density multifamily along with some commercial retail and office uses for a mixed neighborhood environment. And then we would track plat it again into some smaller, more manageable parcels. It would be very difficult to have one developer come in and purchase a 9-acre parcel. It would be very expensive. We can increase the value on a per square foot basis by rezoning it and making it smaller parcels, and then they would be sold on competitive sealed bids. And then once that is done, we can determine how many we want to put out at any one time, and so we'll have not only guide the development on what goes there, but also the timing on when it hits the market. So one thing we don't want to do is flood the market with housing before we're ready. And we're available for questions.
Questions for Robin? Mr. Bowski first, and then Mr. Croft and Mr. Steele.
Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Can you come back to me?
Croft?
I'm getting old, apparently.
So the rezone must change the value, right?
It does. It would increase the value from an R3 to an R4A. It will. It allows higher density and allows commercial uses.
We could rezone it now to a much more restricted zone, and its
Industrial.
appraised value would go down by a couple of million. Buy it at the, what's our most restrictive zoning?
Since this doesn't pertain to you, it only deals with myself and Felix, it doesn't matter what you want.
It does, it
No,
saves
you
us
said
a
my
couple
favorite.
million bucks.
Strategy, Mr. Clark.
Okay. And then, Mr. Schutte and I serve on the ACDA board, and we have been doing a lot of discussion about what that development activity looks like, how they play with the other players here. Is that something sort of we develop, we lead develop and hire people to do, we ask ACDA or some other entity, like, both he and I are trying to fit all the pieces that we have, both in things we own and things we cooperate with. So would you envision you doing it through the Heritage Land Bank, municipality doing it, some other municipal related entity?
So I think the approach that we've discussed so far is the outcome-based approach that we've taken with other surplus municipal properties, which is we define the outcomes we're looking for. In this case, obviously, with its proximity to the C Street corridor area, the businesses around there, and the Cuddy family jewel in Midtown, we would want to see something that takes advantage of those attributes. And so we would most likely pursue an RFP process again, like we've done with some of our other properties, that puts the onus on the developers who would apply for this to come up with the creative solutions that produce the outcomes that we define in terms of the RFP. So the indirect answer to your question is we wouldn't necessarily see ourselves as a developer, nor necessarily ACDA as a developer, but I can guarantee that ACDA would play a role in some sort of development of that property in conjunction with that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Riley.
Mr. Steele?
I'm hoping that whatever goes in there is a good neighbor to the park. And so, will it have direct access to the park, I presume? Or do we need to put up a fence to dictate that? Or what's the situation in that regard? I'm concerned about a negative impact on the park.
So it's hard to see in the daylight, but the property abuts Cuddy Family Park right now.
Yeah.
And as far as preserving access for, if it's residential development,
Sure.
preserving access to the park, if you're a residential developer and you built a wall around that so you couldn't access the park, you would not be a very good residential developer.
I think
And it would devalue the
And it
property.
would devalue the property. So a good comparison is the hotel development that's going in next to the office
Yeah.
max right here.
Yeah.
They are orienting their building in such a way that there will
Toward
still
the park.
be almost a pedestrian path to access the park, not just for their guests, but from the sidewalk area. So I think that any developer who expresses interest in a property of this type would recognize the value of the park to that
We
property.
certainly want to control vehicular access.
Yes.
Absolutely.
But pedestrian aspect or access to a residential district is probably a plus for everybody.
Yes.
So just hopefully do it well. So,
My Midtown Community Council's gonna have a lot of input on this.
well, it worries me.
I know, but it's all of us. Mr. Bowski?
Yeah, it came back to me. So.
You remember now what you wanted to say?
I do. So a couple questions. I know you said we have a current, appraisal on this at 4 point something, I wrote it down. 4.6. Can you explain to me, can you go to your next slide? That one right there. So within that $382,000, are we talking, we're talking about the cost for rezoning it, we're talking about any remediation that needs to be done, all that kind of stuff. Would you think, I mean, it's a pretty substantial chunk right there, $6 million. In the history of this property, I thought it was acquired by the federal government by like $3 million.
It was probably
Oh, it
about that,
was.
yes.
And it's really gone up that much in value.
It has.
Wow.
Well, and the assumption
Costco
for
Home
the
Depot.
appraisal, the way that the GSA,
Mhm.
the instructions given to the appraiser was highest and best use if rezoned. So they have to they had to give it an R3 zone, but gave it some weight for a rezone because it can be rezoned. But it was interesting that it was sold at a lesser price for a B3 zone because originally it was zoned B3, but the GSA never accepted that zoning, so it reverted back to R3.
Oh, okay, yeah, that was one of my questions. And the other question, just a week or so ago, I got a complaint about homeless on that particular property. Did they reach out to you too?
Yes.
Good, because I directed them, I thought, well, the GSA is probably where you want to go, but I would check with this person and this person. So, well, maybe it's been within the last 2 weeks.
And
But.
this is not the first time, it happens on a yearly basis. We reported it many times, and we work with the GSA because they send an inspector out at the same time that we put it on our list for remediation.
And I would assume, just in that interim, before we can actually start developing on that property or selling it so it can be developed, because the municipality will have control of it, it'll be easier to mitigate those issues than going forward. All right, thank you, Robin.
Pete?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I haven't driven by this site. I've been to Cuddy Park, and I'm trying to remember what's east of there.
Lowe's and
Are
Home
there-
Depot.
Are there buildings there or anything now that we're gonna have to tear
Home Depot.
down? Or
Just a good
Just
fence
trees.
and a big fence.
It's just
It was partially cleared and, some improvements as far as paving and some curbing was completed on it in preparation of building the building. But it was never completed. So, it will take a little bit of remediation for the paving and curbing as they do site development, but that should be all. There's no building.
Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. You said something I didn't quite grasp, something about timing of the development so that it fits with the kind of market demands for housing. Can you explain the strategy there a little bit?
I'm anticipating, and we haven't really looked at a layout yet, but I would imagine we would break it into several smaller tracts, probably 3, 4, 5 smaller tracts. And those would be then sold to a private developer. If you develop the whole entire thing at the same time, you could end up with 450 units on the market all at the same time. We want to make sure that we time it so that we produce the needed housing units at a time when you don't flood the market and start devaluing each of those.
So is that in the context of just that property or all of these efforts that are starting to prosper across town? Because it seems like, we have a lot of moving parts with a lot of units starting to come on production, and I am hearing concerns from people in the real estate industry that we might be overbuilding, which led in some ways to what happened in the 80s. There was tons more stock than there were people. So hopefully it's in context of those other developments too.
Not only is it in context, context here, but definitely with the others also. But this housing market is pretty different than downtown.
Right.
They don't really compete with each other, but yes, we're gonna look at everything.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Forrest?
Yeah, I had two questions, and Chris already asked the first one, which is sort of, or you answered it, how many parcels we're talking about. What kind of conversations have you already had with private developers? What kind of interests have they expressed?
Sorry, there's nothing to.
Okay. Is there anyone that is willing to go public and talk about doing this, or has everybody been sort of anonymous?
It's frankly, it's interest. They're asking questions, want to know the time frame and so on, but no one has stepped up and said, please put me first in line to do this.
Why, Mr. Chairman, can I ask a follow-up? Why R4A and why not just B3?
Good question. So, one of the primary motivators for that choice, Senator Dunbar, was the fact that we do want to maximize the site and in proximity to the park. And with the B3 zoning, worst case scenario, what you end up with is another Home Depot.
Sure.
Or some other type of business that does not benefit the park or the surrounding area.
True, but if we broke it into smaller parcels, that would get rid of the big box stores. You can put multifamily housing in B3, right? I mean, you can do an interesting apartment complex, and that would be even more valuable than R4A, right?
Possibly, yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
And again, it depends on the outcomes that we're seeking. And one of the outcomes we are seeking is to help create a neighborhood in an area where no neighborhood exists.
Sure.
There's no residential property in that area that you can see on the map until you get across Tudor.
Eagles across the Tudor, but that's about the closest.
Correct.
No. Anything else, Forrest?
No, that's it. Thank you.
And that,
Mr. Steele?
There's not any other large parcels available in the area. So there isn't going to be anything in that area to compete with it. But wasn't there a hazmat issue on that parcel?
We have all the environmental studies and it was taken care of.
Okay.
By the federal government?
By putting the landfill, by putting the fill on top of it, is that how they took care of it?
That was a surcharge in preparation of the building.
Okay. We're in negotiations, or I guess still working with folks in housing development off Tudor Road, which is fairly close. We do need a bus barn. I don't think that's in it. I wouldn't argue using
we're
that
done with
quality
you.
parcel.
We're done with you. Felix?
Anyway,
Questions?
No questions from me.
I told the last mayor no bus barn going in there. I'll tell you the same thing. John?
You know, I guess you answered, but my understanding, this was owned by a group that sold it to Rabini, who rezoned it, and the value went up, and then he sold it to the federal government. It was a real coup, because just that rezone was a great payback. And now you're saying maybe that didn't happen, or it was done, but so GSA paid B3 price, but then said we don't want B3. And if that's,
They did not follow through. You have to accept zoning within a certain amount of time.
so they bobbled.
Yes.
Okay, so were it B3, it would probably be quite a bit more valuable right now. So we got kind of lucky then.
This ordinance just approves our acquisition. We may decide that B3 may be the best. Right now, we're looking at an R4A, but as we sit down and do our pre-application, I mean, we may decide that B3, if it was broken into smaller parcels, may be more appropriate. So we're not, that's not predetermined that it's absolutely going to be R4, but that's what we're looking at right now.
And actually, if I can add to that,
Heavy
I think the root of your question, Member Weddleton, was about the price that we're paying for it. I do think it's worth noting that this was the second appraisal that we ordered from GSA. We were unhappy with the first appraisal because it was significantly higher, because it was based on an assumption of B3 zoning. And we pushed back and said, it's not zoned that way. There's no guarantee that it can be rezoned that way. You need to look at something a little more comprehensive. And pushed back and got that second appraisal.
Okay, good. So, and then one more question. So you want to break it up into smaller parcels, which may make sense, but we just cut that big deal with Tudor and Elmore, which was more than 9, was it 8 acres, roughly the size. And that seemed to work out okay. I mean, would you go that route first? I mean, it may be better for some.
It could be, and again, it's not predetermined that we're going to break it up either.
Okay, because I would say a private developer who's large enough to understand how to do this kind of property would know about not flooding the market. They look around and see the lay of land and go, this will be my 15-year project. All right, thanks.
That's all, John? Question, is 40th going to be impacted at all? Because no 40th goes there. Has that been vacated on the other end, or can that road be put through? It was owned by some school teachers. Property along there years ago. Is that road stopped permanently from going through?
Road through the
I
park.
think it's 40th.
On that north end of the property?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be impacted by this, no. The 40th right now kind of ends in the parking lot.
Right. I just want to know if the
The
rest
40th right of way has been vacated.
It was vacated,
It's
okay.
not built now, it was vacated across the park.
Okay, thank you. Other question of assembly members? Yes, Eric.
So we pushed back against the appraisal that said we're assuming a B3, but there's still a bump in the price assuming a speculative rezone, right? They still got an increase.
It was weighted to a R4A rather than a B3.
Why is any amount appropriate there for a rezone that hasn't happened?
since rezones are speculative.
That was the instructions given by GSA. We did not have input on that. And that is how highest and best fair market value is determined by commercial appraisers.
Assuming that there will be a rezone? I mean, it seems like if,
But that there could be a rezone, not necessarily that there will be a rezone.
so it's not going to the full price, it's some 50% approximation of it? Do they?
Percentage is how they weight it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, John.
So I guess moving on,
Send another
interfund
6 notes that
loan.
says we're not going to do it.
So we're going to pull money out of
Something.
capital improvement project fund. How big is that?
Right now, the 602 fund has $18.1 million.
So is this a really good deal? It's a super low interest rate?
This is a super low interest rate. This is 50 basis points lower than this cash pool rate, which I don't have the number in front of me, but it's, I'll be in the 1 percentage point range. So-
Because we're negotiating with ourselves, so we gave ourselves a good deal.
Right, we placed that loan.
Thank you very much.
Competitively, public finance has sort of set out what the common terms would be if we were doing a loan for this property, or if we did a similar sort of financing arrangement to help some other department or entity within the municipality try to do a transaction. So this is just saying we would charge for something else.
Okay, so we're being asked to kind of pre-fund this retirement, police and fire retirement fund is a separate thing. And we're gonna get a loan for that, pay it off over 15 years or something. Can we do this and make it cheaper, something like this?
I
18
don't
million
know
won't
that this
cover it,
has
but-
that level of financial resourcing, as I think as well, tomorrow, that's a good question, tomorrow I'll have our financial advisor and our bond counsel here. I think what they'll tell you is that, that would be seen as more of a loan to ourselves for a transaction that requires a third-party trust arrangement. Probably, I think it'd be somewhere in there, but in this case, we don't have enough money in this account or in these resources to be able to do that. We certainly would have looked at that, to see if there's some less expensive means of providing financing for the certificates of participation.
So, John?
Yes, thank you.
Forrest?
Yeah, I think this is a good idea, and I hope it goes forward, but I wanted to ask you the sort of philosophical question I think some of my constituents are going to ask me, which is, if this is a good place to develop housing or business or whatever, why are we getting inserted at all? Why doesn't the federal government just sell this to a private developer or dispose of it in some way? Why do we have to step in as the middleman?
Only because we want to guide what happens there, because you're absolutely right. If the municipality decides not to take advantage of the congressional act, which allows us to basically have the first right of offer,
Right.
then they will sell it through their process, and it could go to any big box, or they can sell it to anyone.
Okay.
We felt like it was a pivotal piece of property that could enhance, that area, especially with some housing issues.
Given the importance of Cuddy Park, I want to make sure it's done correctly. We only got one chance to get this done right. Chris?
Yeah, so I just seem to recall in my kind of jumbled memory that Siri or one of the native corporations had a proposed development for this land. Has that been part of the discussion? Because I have in fact heard that. No?
I hadn't heard that.
I'll declare a conflict. I'm on the Siri board, so I don't believe, I'll declare a conflict. I'm not aware of anything.
Okay. I definitely heard some native corporation had discussed the possibility of developing on that land.
It's for the corporations, so they're in Siri.
project in that area.
Tim?
I like the idea of mixed use in that you've got the two building supply operations and to have some commercial, some retail or something on that particular corner might be to kind of as a transition to housing would be a good idea. But the housing in the back with the park view and the park access, to me, is a good attribute. So.
Well, we felt like the mixed use would give the neighborhood type mixed use, so you're exactly right.
Like
It would
system
be
housing.
Transition to the big box. But what an awesome place to live,
Yeah.
next to the park, close to Natural Pantry, across from the cinemas.
Transportation,
private-
everything.
Behind
yeah,
Lowe's.
private library.
And the library.
Yeah, it doesn't get
And the
much better
assembly
in this
chambers.
town.
Yeah.
And the assembly chamber.
Yeah, and the assembly chamber.
Bonus.
Walking distance of the movie theater and a Walmart. Dairy Queen down the street.
Okay, I think we're done. There's nothing, any germane. We're done.